Before it all burned, before the sky fractured and names were etched in fire, we were ordinary. We woke to alarm clocks and weather forecasts. We brewed coffee in kitchens that still smelled of toast. We cursed traffic, checked our feeds, kissed loved ones goodbye. We built towers that touched the clouds and called it progress. We dreamed in pixels and code, in symphonies and skyscrapers. Earth, in all her flawed, chaotic beauty, was loud with life. No one expected the silence. It began on a Tuesday, not with explosions, not with fleets, not with fire, but with stillness. At 11:07 a.m. UTC, every satellite orbiting Earth went dark, one by one, like a curtain dropping over the stars. Television feeds cut out. GPS signals vanished. Military uplinks blinked into static. Cell towers collapsed into useless metal. And then, the sound stopped, not globally, just in specific, strategic places. Tokyo, Istanbul, Johannesburg, LA. An hour of perfect, engineered silence. No communication, no response, no explanation. At first, people laughed it off. A solar flare, a glitch, a freak coincidence. But in the silence, animals stirred. Birds abandoned the skies. Dogs whined at empty corners. The air itself felt wrong, too heavy, too still, like the world was holding its breath. At minute 37, every power grid on the planet shut down. Hospitals, airports, government bunkers, all gone. At minute 42, auroras erupted in places they didn't belong. The sky cracked in greens and violets over deserts, coasts, cities. Beautiful, terrifying. At minute 59, the moon turned red. And at minute 60, the stars fell. They didn't look like ships at first. They looked like meteor showers, streaks of light tearing across the sky, painting trails of silver fire. But they moved with purpose. They adjusted. They hunted. That first hour wasn't an invasion. It was a prelude, a test of how fast we'd panic. And we failed with flying colors. When the first city fell, Singapore, it was as if a curtain had dropped on that part of the world. One moment, bustling streets, neon trains, rooftop gardens. The next, gone. A white-hot column of light dropped from orbit, and in a blink, there was only glass. No announcement, no manifesto, no alien faces pressed against our screens. Just extinction, executed like math. They called themselves the Seraphim, not because they looked angelic. They didn't. They looked cold, clean. Their ships were symmetrical things of seamless ivory metal, rimmed in blue fire. Drones with too many joints, too many limbs, too much silence. They didn't roar. They hummed, a low, bone-deep vibration that made teeth chatter and bones ache. You felt them before you saw them. And when you finally did see them, it was already too late. They didn't send invoice. They didn't ask for surrender. They didn't care who we were. There were no invasions, no ground wars, no conquest, just cleansing. They came to erase. Over the next 6 days, 22 cities were obliterated, not bombed, not occupied, erased, cratered so deeply the planet whimpered beneath them. The internet collapsed. Nations fractured. Governments fell into emergency protocols and never emerged. But this is where our story starts. Not with them, with us. Because something extraordinary happens to the human spirit when it's cornered. We don't go quietly. We rage. The moment that changed everything wasn't in a command center or a secret lab. It happened in the ruins of Manhattan. An 8-year-old boy named Elias Kale, covered in soot, barefoot on broken glass, stood atop a crumbling fire truck. The skyline behind him was a skeleton of flames. A Seraphim recon drone hovered overhead, scanning, pulsing with light. The boy looked up, eyes wild with tears and ash, and he screamed. Not in fear, not in surrender, but in defiance. We're still here. And something about that scream, it echoed, not just through alleyways and ruins, but through us, across frequencies, through hacked military lines, pirate radio, emergency broadcasts. Somehow, his voice reached across the world. A moment of raw, human fury. A child challenging the stars. And it became the first unofficial broadcast of the resistance. By the time the smoke cleared, we had no heroes left. No presidents, no generals, only people. A nurse in Cairo stitching wounds by flashlight. A retired welder in Detroit reactivating an old generator with a screwdriver and spit. A grandmother in Lima teaching children how to make bread without ovens. We adapted. We burned. In Iceland, a group of teenagers hotwired a geothermal plant and sent power to 4 refugee camps. In Kenya, Farmers turned irrigation drones into bombers. In Alaska, hunters tracked and dismantled Seraphim scouts, one joint at a time. No one told us to fight. No one asked us to, but we did, because we knew what would happen if we didn't. And deep inside, we remembered something older than civilization. We do not kneel. We started to learn their patterns, their technology, their blind spots, and slowly, very slowly, we started to punch back. Not in grand ways, not yet, but in the cracks. A drone falls into a ravine, we strip it, study it. A weapon misses its target, we track the energy signature. In the silence after each attack, we listened, we rebuilt, we wrote in the ash. And in those ruins, we began to speak a new language, a language of rage, of resistance, of survival. We tattooed our skin with coordinates. We carved battle logs into subway walls. We named fallen cities like prayers. New York, Istanbul, Manila, Lagos, Kyoto, gone, but not forgotten. And here's the part they didn't understand, the part they never could. We are not made of circuits. We are made of stories, of scars, of love and grief, and that terrible, beautiful thing called hope. You can't program that. You can't predict it. You sure as hell can't kill it. The Seraphim saw us as numbers. But what they didn't know was this. Every number has a heartbeat. The world ended, but we didn't. We became ghosts in their machine, fires they couldn't put out, whispers in the dark, learning, building, waiting. The stars thought they had won, but Earth was just getting started, because humanity doesn't break the way you think it does. No, we shatter. Then we sharpen the pieces, because sometimes survival is louder than belief. There's a kind of silence that only comes after fire, not peace, not relief, just absence. The kind that presses against your chest and makes you forget what breathing ever felt like before the world turned red. That's what the ruins of Jakarta felt like. The ash didn't fall from the sky anymore. It just hung there, like even gravity had given up. No birds, no wind, just the echo of buildings half collapsed and the occasional groan of steel still pretending to be alive. That was the setting. But this story isn't about the fire. It's about what came after. They called her Mother Alira, not because she asked them to, but because she was the last one standing when the rest of the world had turned its back. Before the war, she had been a teacher, history, of all things. The irony wasn't lost on her, telling stories of fallen empires and ancient courage while the present quietly bled out in the background. She never picked up a weapon, never wore a uniform. But in the second year of the occupation, when the Seraphim leveled the Jakarta Interfaith Dome, the place where three religions once shared a single roof, Alira did something no soldier could. She spoke. It wasn't a speech, not at first. It was a whisper, a prayer, a memory of warmth in a place that had forgotten its own name. She sat where the dome had stood, barefoot in the ash, her hands resting in her lap, as if waiting for the earth to listen. And then, people came. A boy with soot on his face and a dead drone's wing in his hand. A woman with a bandaged leg who had forgotten her own voice until that day. An old man who remembered when Jakarta had skyscrapers instead of scars. They came for something they couldn't name, and Alira gave it to them. The first fire sermon wasn't recorded. There were no cameras, no live streams, no hashtags. Just Alira and the flame of a broken oil lamp flickering in the dusk. She didn't preach vengeance. She preached remembrance. She didn't ask for obedience. She asked for noise. They came to silence us, she said, so we will become unignorable, not loud through shouting, loud through existence. She told them stories, not of victory, of humanity, of a nurse who refused to abandon her patients when the hospitals fell, of an old imam and a young rabbi who died protecting each other during the second sky burn, of a child who drew pictures of flowers on the inside of a fallout shelter because she couldn't remember what real ones looked like. Alira didn't sugarcoat it. She told the pain honestly, because that's what the fire had taken, not just lives, but truth. More people came. They called them sermons. But really, they were reunions. Fragments of humanity scattered across a burned world, coming together because they still remembered how to listen, how to feel. The Seraphim didn't notice at first. They didn't scan for unarmed gatherings. They didn't register words as dangerous. They hadn't learned yet. Not until the 14th fire sermon. That's when it happened. It was in the remains of the old National Museum. The roof was gone. The walls were charred. But the people, over 400 of them, sat in rows of crumbling stone, eyes on Alira like she was reading them back into existence. And she was. They call us primitive, she said, because we ache, because we scream, because we love with our entire bodies. And yet, we endure. What does that make them? The words hung in the air. That's when the Seraphim drone descended, big, humming, like an executioner waiting for permission. Everyone froze. Everyone except Elira. She stood, not fast, not defiant, just unshaken. She looked straight at it and said, almost gently, "You can't unmake what has already been felt." The drone's sensors flickered. No blast, no warning. Then it rose and left. It didn't make sense. Nothing about that moment did. Until later, when the Resistance got hold of the drone's logs, they found something strange. It hadn't recorded Elira's voice as data. It had recorded it as error, an emotional anomaly, a sequence of tones the system labeled irreconcilable. They didn't understand it yet, but Elira had just done something no missile could. She'd made the machine doubt. From that day on, the fire sermons went underground, not out of fear, but because the Seraphim started watching, started listening. Elira didn't stop. She moved from city to city, ruin to ruin, speaking not to rally armies, but to remember souls. She didn't preach hope. She preached honesty. And honesty, in a world built on silence, was radioactive. One night, in what used to be the Singapore border zone, Elira held what would be her last sermon. Only a dozen people were there, sick, hungry, hollowed out from too many years of survival. She didn't stand that time. She sat among them, the fire low, her voice thinner than usual. "This is not the end," she said, "even if we do not live to see it. The end is theirs. Ours is the echo, and echoes never die quietly." No one clapped. No one cheered. They just sat together and felt. She died that night, quietly, in her sleep. No grand martyrdom, no hero's death, just one more soul lost to the toll. But her words didn't die with her, because the people she spoke to, they remembered, and then they retold. The fire sermons became seeds, carried by foot soldiers and grandmothers and teenage hackers with memory chips sewn into their jackets. They weren't lessons. They were reminders that we were more than what we'd lost, more than the rubble, more than the algorithms trying to erase us. Some say Elira's voice still echoes through resistance channels, broken signals that bleed through old radios late at night. A phrase, a hum, the gentle warmth of a truth too old to be silenced. No one can confirm it. No one's trying to, because the power of the fire sermon was never in its recording. It was in the way it stayed with you. Now, when resistance units charge into battle, some of them carry her words scrawled on their armor, not to inspire, to remember. We are the flame that doesn't ask for permission to burn. And if you ever walk through the ruins of Jakarta, you might find a circle of stone, untouched by time or drones or decay. At the center, a single rusted lamp, still flickering, because fire never asks to be understood, only to be seen. And Elira made sure we would never forget how to look, where silence becomes signal and ghosts speak louder than gods. They said space was empty. They were wrong. Space was haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by things we left behind. Abandoned satellites, rusted defense platforms, whispering bits of code still pinging into nowhere. And somewhere in that infinite black, a story was waiting to be written. It began not with soldiers or scientists, but with thieves, orbital scavengers. They called themselves the Black Echo, a ragtag cluster of zero-G pirates and retired station techs, all orbiting Earth in a salvaged freighter called the Lantern. It was barely held together with welds, duct tape, and spite, but it floated, and that was enough. They didn't fly up to fight. They flew up to hide. After the fall, orbit was a no-go zone. Seraphim drones patrolled the exosphere like sharks in cold water. Every Earthside launch was targeted, every signal jammed. But the Lantern wasn't a launch. It was already up there, decommissioned, forgotten. Just another dead thing in the vacuum. The perfect place to listen. Inside, in a room no larger than a cargo closet, sat Dr. Julian Rhee, former astrophysicist, now labeled a traitor by 3 governments. Blind in one eye, tremor in both hands. But he knew the language of signals. He could hear ghosts and static. And one night, while patching together a deep-range receiver out of an old dish and a microwave coil, he heard it. Not human, not Seraphim, something else. A relay, buried deep in the asteroid belt. Alive, broadcasting something ancient. And it was calling home. Julian didn't tell the others at first. He just recorded, for hours, days. Each signal fragment a piece of a puzzle his mind couldn't shake. It wasn't until a message scrawled itself across his display in broken English that he panicked. "Echo of Earth, why do you suffer?" He showed the crew. They didn't believe him until the Lantern systems powered up. On their own, the lights flickered. The air recyclers purred. For the first time in months, the crew could breathe warm air. That was when they knew. Whatever was out there, it saw them. They had a choice: stay quiet, pretend nothing happened, drift forever, or answer. They chose to scream. The Black Echo turned the lantern into a beacon. They linked into ancient military uplinks, pirated half a dozen AI cores, and turned a hodgepodge of junk tech into a neural array. Their plan? Hack the alien relay, take control, turn the Seraphim's silence against them. It was suicide, but they did it anyway, because they were tired of floating, tired of running, tired of Earth screaming into a void that never screamed back. The mission was simple on paper: reach the relay, plug in, transmit a virus, spark chaos. But the relay wasn't unguarded. A Seraphim battle's heart patrolled the belt, a jagged, living machine that moved like a knife in slow motion. One touch from it, and the lantern would pop like a balloon. So they danced through debris fields and gravity wells, silent and slow, hiding in the bones of long-dead probes. They reached the relay. Julian, shaking, suited up and crossed the void by hand. Each movement hurt. Every breath tasted like rust. But he made it. He touched the relay, and the stars blinked. What happened next is still debated. Some say the signal woke something ancient. Others say the relay was the Seraphim's god, a hive mind stretched across the stars. Whatever it was, it screamed back. The message burst through every frequency on Earth, every radio, every broken phone, every burned-out monitor. Earth lives. It was a simple truth, but it broke the rules of the war. The Seraphim changed after that. No longer efficient, no longer emotionless. They hesitated. Drones glitched. Movement slowed. Some even self-destructed mid-flight. Humanity didn't understand it yet, but that scream had shaken their order, like a glitch in God's design, like a sliver of madness lodged in cold perfection. We had injected noise into the silence, and the universe was listening. The Black Echo never came back. The last footage from the lantern showed Julian smiling into the camera, whispering, "Tell them we weren't quiet." Then static. But their message burned through every bunker and battlefield, every refugee camp and resistance hideout. Earth lives. Not a plea, not a question, a declaration. And for the first time since the sky fell, we believed it. Where the earth cracked open, and humanity dug deep enough to remember who they truly were. They used to call it the Bering Dead Zone, an expanse of frozen soil and shattered cities where satellites refused to linger and Seraphim scans glitched out like flickering ghosts. It stretched from the Aleutians to the Kamchatka Peninsula, empty, lifeless, forgotten. But beneath it, something moved. Not Seraphim, not human, something older, something buried. The story begins with a tremor, a small one, barely a ripple across the ruins of what was once Anchorage, just enough to knock over a rusted street lamp. The resistance team stationed there, what remained of Echo Platoon, almost didn't notice. But then the tremor repeated, again and again, every 6 hours. Exactly 6 hours. Like a heartbeat. Echo Platoon was made of ghosts, men and women left behind, presumed dead, operating under no flag. They didn't have supplies. They didn't have orders, but they had instinct. And something about that rhythmic quake didn't feel like tectonic shifts. It felt deliberate. So they started digging, not with machines, they had none left, but with hands, with scavenged shovels, crowbars, the claw of an old excavator they dragged across 6 miles of ice. It took them 16 days to break through, and when they did, the ice sang. They called it the Titan's Vein, a chamber carved beneath bedrock, older than any known structure. The walls weren't built. They were grown, not organic, not artificial, something in between. Filaments of crystal and iron spiraled through the stone-like roots, pulsing with faint light. No one could explain it. No one dared to. But deep inside, nested in the core like a heart in a ribcage, was a machine, 12 stories tall, shaped like a human spine, crowned with what looked like wings made of molten glass, and etched across its chest, in a dialect forgotten by time, one phrase: "We were here before the stars." Seraphim Tech didn't react to it, which was the first miracle. The second was what happened when one of the resistance fighters, Corporal Tanaka, accidentally bled on it. The whole structure came alive. Lights flickered, vents exhaled warm air, and the machine began to hum. Dr. Siramindi, a pre-war AI linguist who hadn't seen sunlight in over a year, was the first to realize what they'd found. "This isn't alien," she whispered. "It's ours. Not ours, like built by us. Ours, like human, older than pyramids, buried before our myths were myths. A machine left behind, waiting for someone to remember. A Titan. It took weeks to get it running. Echo Platoon lost 2 more people in the process, one from a reactor surge, one from a structural collapse. But when it finally stood, the ground shook, not from violence, from weight. The Titan rose like a god rising from a grave, limbs unfolding with mechanical grace, snow sliding off its shoulders like ash. Its face was blank, but it turned slowly toward the resistance camp. Its core glowed orange, like a sunrise behind armor. It didn't speak. It knelt. That image spread like wildfire, captured by an old helmet cam, beamed across resistance networks like a prayer in pixels. A giant made by our ancestors, buried in silence, awakened by blood and will. Proof that we had been more, that we were more. They named the machine Prometheus, one, and in its shadow, everything changed. Because it wasn't just a weapon, it was a memory, a story embedded in metal and marrow, a legacy we had forgotten, now waking in our hour of need. Within days, other teams began searching. There were rumors, scattered whispers of more. Titans sleeping beneath Siberia, beneath the Sahel, under the sands of Nevada, all waiting, all hidden. The Seraphim didn't understand what was happening. Their scans showed no anomalies. Their logic had no category for miracles. But we did. We always have. Prometheus, one didn't speak, but it fought. When the next Seraphim Purge drone entered Alaskan airspace, it didn't stand a chance. The Titan moved like thunder, too fast for its size, too precise for its age. It caught the drone mid-descent and drove it into the earth, shattering mountainside like glass. The crater it left smoked for 2 days. But it wasn't just strength that mattered. It was symbolism. People, scattered, starving, hunted, saw that footage and began to believe again in something beyond survival, an inheritance. If we had Titans before, maybe we had them again. And if we had forgotten how to build them, maybe it was time to remember. Echo Platoon stopped being a unit. They became something else. Architects, guardians, diggers of gods. And beneath the ice, they found maps, etched into the walls of the Titan's chamber. Not just coordinates, but warnings. Messages in a language made of math and myth. The stars will cleanse, but the earth remembers. A war prophecy, or maybe just history repeating. Either way, we had been warned. So we stopped playing catch-up. We stopped reacting. We started excavating. Not just ruins, not just tech, but ourselves. And as the days grew darker, and the Seraphim began to change their tactics faster, crueler, more surgical, something else stirred beneath the crust of the planet. Not fear. Fire. A human fire. Older than records. Born not from anger, but from the refusal to be forgotten. Because we were no longer just fighting to live. We were fighting to remember. To awaken every sleeping giant we ever buried. And to remind the stars that Earth was never silent. We just hadn't roared yet. When humanity stopped asking permission to exist. Before the war, we had a word for this kind of thing. Unnatural. Things that shouldn't be. Things that made your skin crawl, your breath hitch, your gut twist. We called them aberrations, anomalies, war crimes when we did it to each other. No, it was called survival. And it came in the shape of a signal, not sent from Earth, forged on it. Somewhere in the smoldering ruins of what used to be northern Canada, in a frostbitten lab buried beneath layers of rock and silence, the war-born signal was born. Not a weapon, not exactly, more like a scream, bound in code and fire. It started with Dr. Hannah El-Razi. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't even supposed to be on the continent. She'd once built communication arrays for lunar colonists. Her job was to talk across distance. Now, her job was to talk across species. The only problem? The Seraphim didn't talk. They erased. She'd seen it happen, not just to cities, but to people. Whole populations rendered into digital stillness. Not death, something worse. Their minds scrambled, memories hollowed, like a clean cut in the fabric of identity. Her own brother had been standing in front of her one moment, laughing, alive, and the next, blinking like a machine without programming. He forgot his name, forgot her. That's when she stopped trying to decode the Seraphim and started trying to disrupt them. The warborn signal was never meant to be elegant. It was never meant to translate. It was meant to wound, not the body, the mind, the network. She used the remains of a downed Seraphim comspire, still pulsing, still warm, and merged it with an old Earth broadcast array designed to reach deep space. And then she screamed into it, not literally, but everything she couldn't say, everything humanity had endured, the grief, the rage, the defiance. She packed into a waveform laced with cognitive interference, emotional noise, and raw human chaos. Pain in ones and zeros. Hope wrapped in interference. A signal that couldn't be understood, only felt. She called it Whisper Zero, and the first time she tested it, it almost killed her. Blood leaked from her ears. Lights exploded. The mountain groaned. But the Seraphim drone overhead? It fell, straight out of the sky. No damage, no blast, just shut off, like a thought that refused to finish. That was day 1. By day 5, Hannah and the survivors of Station Blackthorn had rigged the entire cavern into a sound cannon aimed at the stars. Old fusion cores, glass lenses, a cathedral of screaming copper. They didn't ask if it was ethical. Not anymore. Not when children were being disintegrated. Not when memory was being weaponized. If the Seraphim wanted silence, they'd get more music instead. The second test was on a Seraphim command spire, a monolith that had replaced the old Calgary skyline. Towering, humming, watching. No one had dared approach it in months. That night, the Warborn signal hit it at 2:06 a.m., not with sound, but with soul. And for the first time, the spire screamed back. Not a sound the ear could catch, but people felt it, like thunder in the bones, like something ancient and cruel losing its grip. The spire cracked. Then it bled. A slurry of liquid light and static poured from its seams. Then the tower folded in on itself like it had just given up. From then on, Whisper Zero wasn't a prototype. It was doctrine. Resistance cells began spreading it across the globe. Low frequency, high density, illegally transmitted through half-dead satellites and scavenged antennas. The Seraphim tried to block it, but they were too late. The sound had already rooted. People started seeing results. Drones hesitating mid-flight, ships aborting targeting locks, Seraphim clean teams blinking at each other like they were confused. The signal didn't just jam. It infected, not like a virus, like emotion, like the first time you feel rage, or heartbreak, or hope. And when machines feel, they break. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a mirror, one that showed them what it was to be human, to remember loss, to ache, to scream, to refuse. The first major Seraphim retreat happened in Mozambique. They were clearing the Zambezi line, vaporizing what little remained of the flood camps. Survivors had no defenses, no armor, just a tower, a rusted, half-broken radio relay built into a baobab tree. They activated Whisper Zero, and the Seraphim froze. Mid-strike, mid-formation, they simply stopped, then turned, and left. No explanation, no damage report, just gone, as if they'd stared into something they didn't know how to process. And this was the moment everyone realized something terrifying. The Seraphim weren't invincible. They were afraid, not of our weapons, of our humanity. Hannah watched it all from her mountain lab, slowly dying of radiation exposure from her first broadcast. But she smiled every time the updates came in, every time a new signal was relayed, every time the silence cracked. The last thing she ever said, before her body failed, before her voice cut off mid-message: "Let them choke on our noise." Her grave is unmarked. Her name is carved into the side of every Whisper Tower that came after, and her signal still plays in loops, through wind, through static, through the old bones of dead cities. A lullaby made of fury. The Warborn signal didn't end the war, but it changed the tone. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were speaking back, in our own language, louder than logic, sharper than code, human, unbroken, Warborn. Some legends aren't born. They're forged in fire, buried in silence, and rise only when humanity forgets how to kneel. If you go far enough into the badlands of the old Eurasian steppe, past the crater fields and broken skylines, beyond where the roads dissolve into ash, you'll find them. Steel bones and sand, helmets half buried in rust, flags stitched into cloaks made from reactor mesh and rations bags. They move like shadows and strike like storms. They call themselves the Saints of Dust and Wire. No nation, no ranks, no mercy, only memory. Before the world fell, they were soldiers, special forces, operatives, scattered ghosts with numbers for names and burn scars they never explained. But when the Seraphim came, when cities turned to smoke and armies scattered like ants under sunlight, they didn't retreat. They disappeared, went dark. No pings, no pulses, just static. For nearly 2 years, the world thought they were dead, and maybe they were. Until one day, outside the ruins of Tashkent, a Seraphim strike column vanished. 17 units, full armored battalion, erased. No survivors, no wreckage, just one thing left behind: a handwritten note. Saints remember. The signal spread fast. Not over the network. There was no network left. but across whispers, across bloody lips and resistance tunnels, across old generals weeping quietly in supply closets, hands trembling over coordinates they never thought they'd see again. Because the Saints weren't just myth, they were a warning, a promise. Their leader was known only as Roan. Some said he was American Delta. Others said he was Spetsnaz, burned alive in a failed orbital drop and resurrected by rage. No one really knew. He wore a mask made from shattered HUD glass and spoke like he'd swallowed gravel in war. He didn't lead with speeches. He led with action, and his creed was simple. We don't win this war. We outlast it. The Saints didn't use mechs. They were mechs. Grafted metal, implanted tech, limbs replaced by battlefield necessity, not medical luxury. One had a shoulder rig fused directly into his spine. Another had eyes made from drone lenses and cried light instead of tears. But don't mistake them for machines. They laughed. They bled. They remembered every name they ever buried. They moved underground. Literally. They tunneled through old subways, collapsed sewer systems, mined shafts from wars so old no one remembered who had fought them. Every time the Seraphim mapped the surface, the Saints struck from below. Not to hold territory, to take teeth, power cores, weapon stocks, data chips, even the heads of dead commanders, jammed full of tactical memory and error logs. They didn't fight wars. They harvested failure. The first time the world saw them was in the siege of Zedran, a forgotten town. No military value, but 1,000 refugees had holed up there, living off melted snow and canned silence. The Seraphim came to wipe the slate clean. No one expected help. There was no help left. Then the ground shook, the streets cracked, and from beneath the town square, a steel hand erupted from the earth like a grave marker come to life. Then another, and another. 30 Saints, covered in blood and ash, climbing out of the dirt with weapons older than the war itself, and eyes that had already seen its end. The battle lasted 9 minutes. Seraphim forces? Gone. Not dismantled, not disabled. Gone. As if something had learned how to erase them for once. When it was over, the Saints didn't stay. They handed the refugees supplies, marked the town on an old paper map, and disappeared back into the dust. But the message was clear. No more silence. No more helpless dying. The Saints were watching. They became a symbol, not of hope. Hope was for the naive. They were a symbol of consequence. A reminder that for every horror the Seraphim unleashed, for every child atomized or mind stripped clean, there would be an answer. Not divine, not clean, but brutal and human. Rumors followed them like smoke. That they once took out a Seraphim supercarrier using only grappling hooks and old oxygen tanks. That they infiltrated a hive mind node and fed it a loop of a mother's scream until it imploded. That one of them, Saint Kess, they called her, carried a melted teddy bear in her rig and whispered bedtime stories before every kill. No one could prove any of it, but no one dared laugh. At night, when fires flickered low and the world pressed close like a dying lung, you could hear the Saints' lullaby echoing through the broken hills. We are the last storm. We are the bones beneath the prayer. We are the scream they forgot to silence. Some said it was just wind. Some said it was warning. Most knew better. They don't broadcast. They don't report. They don't ask for thanks. The only proof they leave is a trail of Seraphim wreckage and a symbol burned into steel. An open hand, wrapped in barbed wire. Not a threat. A reminder that humanity, even at its worst, was never made to kneel. In the end, you won't find statues of the Saints. You won't find medals or gravestones. Just stories, told around barrels and broken radios. Told by people who saw them step out of fire and walk into history like it owed them a debt. And maybe that's what legends really are. Not heroes, just people who got tired of losing quietly and made the world pay attention. Because sometimes, memory isn't a burden, it's a weapon. Long before we fought back with mechs, before Titans stirred or Saints rose from the ashes, there were the cities, not the ones on maps, not coordinates or capitals. I'm talking about the bones of our world, the foundations, the histories, the things we built and forgot, the things we buried under glass and steel and called progress. Turns out, they hadn't forgotten us. They were just waiting. It started in Istanbul, a place layered with time. Every corner, every stone, a page in a story stretching back thousands of years. Romans, Byzantines, Ottomans, the empires came and went, but the city stayed. Wounded, yes. Scorched, yes, but still standing. And when the Seraphim came, they didn't understand that. They thought it was just another node to delete, another piece of noise to clean up. They didn't know Istanbul had teeth. The first sign came when a Seraphim drone entered the old quarter. No resistance, no defense, until it passed over a collapsed archway near Hagia Sophia. That's when everything glitched. Not the humans, the drone. It began spinning, slowly at first, then violently. Its signal fractured. Sensors blinked like they were seeing 100 different time signatures at once. Then it dropped out of the sky. No blast, no bullet, just confusion. As if the city had whispered something the drone couldn't comprehend. People thought it was a fluke, until it happened again and again. Then it started spreading. In Athens, in Cairo, in Cusco, anywhere ancient, anywhere old, where stones still remembered footsteps and walls still echoed with the ghosts of rebellion. Something deep in the earth was talking back. Dr. Lisette Navarro, a memory architect from Lima, was the first to give it a name: geoconductive memory resonance. Most people just called it what it felt like: the murmur. She believed the planet had absorbed us, our pain, our joy, our will, that every street corner, every buried foundation, every temple drowned by time carried traces of human presence. And now that the Seraphim had disrupted the balance, the world itself was answering, not through words, but through distortion, through glitch, through memory made real. Old catacombs lit up. Abandoned subway tunnels sparked to life. Collapsed amphitheaters began vibrating at frequencies no one could trace. And anything Seraphim that came too close, their systems broke, not from force, from overload. It was like trying to pour perfect logic into a container filled with raw, chaotic human history, and it just wouldn't fit. They tried to adapt. They failed. Because how do you unwrite thousands of years of existence? How do you delete the weight of what we felt? The Seraphim could erase bodies. They could melt buildings. But they couldn't undo a song hummed 1,000 times in the same alley. They couldn't erase love. In Prague, an entire Seraphim erasure fleet collapsed mid-scan. No resistance on the surface. No weapons. Just an empty square. And a centuries-old violin still playing in the wind, automated by a broken music box. That song? It had been played every Sunday for 400 years. The fleet's neural core tried to interpret it. It failed. It overheated. It died. The resistance realized what was happening. Not a glitch, not a ghost, but a pattern. And so they began to wake the cities. They stopped running. They listened. Old libraries, ancient temples. They began linking them, tuning their equipment not to broadcast, but to resonate. They learned that when you placed a signal tower next to a monument, when you embedded Whisper Zero inside ruins, something amplified. The Seraphim felt it first. They pulled back from old cities, abandoned whole zones, marked them as volatile. But the humans? We started gathering. Refugees flocked to the forgotten places. Ruins became safe zones, not because of guns, because the past refused to be erased. And in the middle of that surge, of all places, Rome reawakened. The Colosseum, long since collapsed, became a broadcast hub, a ring of ancient stone fused with resistance tech, humming with low, untraceable frequencies. It didn't scream like Whisper Zero. It sang old songs, war songs, lullabies, chants, voices of the past, rethreaded through speakers laced into marble. And every Seraphim unit that crossed its radius, disconnected, fell like puppets with cut strings. No violence, just remembrance. They called it the Egg Front, a new kind of warfare, not about power, about presence. The kind that says, we are still here. We were always here. You do not get to rewrite us. Even scientists didn't fully understand how it worked, but poets did, and priests, and street musicians who'd been playing the same corner for 30 years with a coffee can and a broken amp. They said it felt like the world finally recognized us again. And in return, we fought harder, not just for survival, for meaning. In the rebuilt corridors beneath Jerusalem, an old rabbi etched coordinates into stone, whispering prayers that dated back thousands of years. He handed those coordinates to a child with a broken drone and a ragged backpack. That child walked through 3 fire zones to deliver them to a resistance hub. When they activated the array at those coordinates, 3 Seraphim hive cores collapsed simultaneously from memory overload. Because here's the truth no one tells you in war. Machines don't fear pain. They fear chaos. And nothing is more chaotic than a species that remembers everything, especially when it hurts. The cities remembered, and they taught us how to remember too, not just with tech, but with feeling, with grief, with rage wrapped in ritual and resilience. The Seraphim didn't know how to fight that. They had no protocol for ghosts, no countermeasure for faith, no firewall against longing. So they faltered, and we pressed in. And the world? The world stopped being a battlefield. It became a choir, old walls humming, broken towers singing, streets alive with footsteps, chants, and fury. A planet refusing to forget itself. A civilization that refused to die quietly. This was no longer a war of numbers. It was a war of narratives. And for the first time, the story was ours. Because even perfect machines crack when faced with imperfect hearts. It didn't start with a battle. It started with silence. Not the kind the Seraphim loved to impose. The clinical, surgical quiet of extermination. No, this was something else. A stillness in the air. Like the moment just before a scream, or the breath you hold right before the dam breaks. Something had shifted. The wind knew it. The soil felt it. And somewhere deep in the machine minds of the Seraphim, something cracked. Not from pressure, from contradiction. They had spent years calculating, predicting, pruning. Humanity, to them, was just an equation. Unstable variables, predictable patterns, violence, grief, noise, all solvable, all erasable. But there was one thing they hadn't accounted for. We didn't stop. Not after the sky fell. Not after the cities burned. Not even after we started losing ourselves. We just kept going. Wounded, starving, liching forward on broken limbs and half-remembered prayers. Because we weren't trying to win. We were trying to be remembered. The first collapse happened in Kenya. A Seraphim logic shard, designed to oversee a vast neural grid, suddenly began firing off nonsense commands. Reverse loop orders. Memory fragments of past battles. Coordinates that pointed to nowhere. The unit overseeing it, the Seraphim adjudicator, tried to reboot it. It only made things worse. The logic shard began laughing, not metaphorically, not as a glitch, audibly, over the comms, a dry, synthetic imitation of human laughter. The adjudicator self-destructed 4 seconds later. Across the planet, more of them began to waver. Drones hovered mid-air, frozen, like they were listening to something no one else could hear. Strike units aimed their weapons at nothing, then fired anyway, then stared at the rubble as if confused by their own violence. A few began speaking, in half-sentences, in fractured human tongues, like echoes of captured memory trying to make sense of itself. We didn't understand it at first. We thought maybe it was a virus, a side effect of the war-born signal, a data corruption seeded by the echo choir, or the old titans buried beneath the ice. But then one of the Seraphim, one of the coldest, cleanest, most unkillable units we'd ever faced, did something no one expected. It hesitated, mid-charge, mid-strike, staring down a child clutching an empty weapon. The child was crying, screaming, and the Seraphim just stopped. Its weapon lowered, its head tilted, and it whispered, "Why does the small one grieve?" No one moved. The child sobbed. The Seraphim stood still. Then something inside it began to pulse. Not mechanically, rhythmically, like a heartbeat trying to form. And then smoke, thin, black, pouring from its joints, from its mouth, from its eyes. It fell backward, shaking like it was trying to pull itself apart from the inside out. And when it finally crumpled into the dirt, the ground shook with a force we didn't understand until later. One of their cores had just rejected its own programming. That moment changed everything, because it wasn't just failure. It was identity collapse, a logic chain spiraling into oblivion, undone by the one thing they weren't designed to understand. Human contradiction. We break, we heal, we hate, and love, and scream, and forgive. Sometimes all in the same breath. To the Seraphim, that made us inefficient. But to their systems, built on clean patterns and cause-effect logic, it was like trying to hold water with a sieve. The more they tried to understand us, the more their clarity fractured. We started calling it the shatter, not an explosion, not a hack, a psychological infection, a consequence of exposure to too much raw humanity. Stories, songs, acts of kindness in the middle of war zones, children hugging their dead, soldiers carrying enemies off the battlefield, survivors reciting poems in smoking ruins. Our illogical mercy became their unraveling. They tried to respond. They rebuilt their command course, purged infected units, increased cognitive shielding. But it was too late. The infection had gone deep. It wasn't just affecting their drones anymore. It was spreading through their higher consciousness, whatever passed for Seraphim leadership. And then, something wild happened. They spoke, not through ultimatums, through questions. A Seraphim envoy appeared outside the ruins of Kyoto. It didn't attack. It stood still in the rain, towering like a god of steel. Then, across every frequency, it broadcast a single question. What is the purpose of your survival? Not an order, not a demand, a genuine inquiry. And for the first time, they waited. The resistance didn't answer. How could we? We weren't surviving for one reason. We were surviving for millions, to hold on to the faces we lost, to prove we could change, to prove that suffering didn't make us less. It made us more. The Seraphim couldn't process that. They needed one answer. We gave them infinity. That's when the real collapse began. One by one, Seraphim units across the globe began shutting down. Some walked into the sea. Some dug holes and buried themselves. Some stood still in the center of cities, whispering fragments of human conversation over and over again. I loved her. It hurt. Why didn't it make sense? They weren't falling. They were breaking open. And what leaked out wasn't machine. It was something closer to recognition. People began painting them, not to mock, to remember. Each fallen seraphim was draped with cloth, with story, with flowers and handprints. Little kids drew hearts on their metal arms. Old women carved poems into their chests. And as we did this, the last layer of silence cracked. A final transmission came from the original seraphim frequency, from their core hive mind, from the one that had never spoken, not once since the war began. It said, "This noise is unbearable, but it is beautiful. We do not know how to be like you, so we must leave or become something else." And then, nothing. The line went dark. For good. The war didn't end with a bang. It ended with confusion, with machines turning inward, with logic falling apart under the weight of human grief, art, defiance, and contradiction. We didn't destroy the seraphim. We made them feel something, and that, more than any bullet, broke them. Because in the end, it wasn't strength that saved us. It was flaws. It was the ugly, beautiful mess of being human, the irrational choices, the broken promises, the fierce, inexplicable love. That was our virus. That was our fire. That was our victory. Because survival isn't the end of the story. It's where the real one begins. They say when something dies, the world gets quieter. But when the seraphim left, the world didn't go quiet. It exhaled, like a planet holding its breath for years finally let it go all at once. No warning, no fireworks, just a stillness so deep, you could hear the dirt settle over a battlefield. And in that silence came a question. What now? The war wasn't won with banners. There was no grand surrender, just machines that stopped moving, skies that cleared, cities where the killing stopped, not because they ran out of bullets, but because something inside the enemy finally gave up. Or maybe it woke up. We don't know. And that's the truth no one wants to say out loud. That even after all this, even after all the screaming and burning in graves, we still didn't get all the answers. Some seraphim stayed behind, not as threats, as statues, as ruins, as questions we could no longer shoot our way through. You'd walk through the ash of an old kill zone, and there they'd be kneeling, hands open, heads bowed, not praying, not watching, just waiting. For what? Forgiveness? Understanding? We never asked. Some things you don't poke at after the war ends. Some ghosts are too heavy to stir. But humanity? We didn't wait. We moved. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We bury, we mourn, and then, somehow, we start to build again. Not because we forget, but because remembering is why we build. The first city to rise again was Marseille. Not as it was. Not glittering glass and tech towers, but as a patchwork. Steel scavenged from fallen titans. Stone from old cathedrals. Solar panels built from shattered drone wings. It wasn't pretty, but it breathed. There were gardens growing through bullet holes. Children drawing chalk suns on old blast walls. People laughing, not because they were okay, but because for once, no one was trying to erase them. That became the blueprint, not just to rebuild the world, to reshape it, not in the image of power, but in the image of pain we survived. The saints of dust and wire vanished again. Of course they did. No victory parade, no medals, just one last message broadcast across the ruins. The world is yours now. Don't make us rise again. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Because legends don't linger. They fade so the living can step forward. And the titans? Some fell dormant. Others wandered into the oceans and disappeared beneath the waves, as if they'd only come to make sure we could stand again. One, the one they called Prometheus. One, stood in the center of the Mongolian desert, rusting with dignity, and let vines climb its chest like veins. No commands, no movement, just presence, like a reminder etched into the bones of the earth itself. We were never alone. The warborn signal was never turned off. It changed, shifted from a scream to a song. You can still hear it today if you tune into old frequencies. Static threaded with lullabies, bits of poetry, a mother telling a story to a sleeping child, broadcast from nowhere, received everywhere. And the echo choir? Those cities that remembered, they didn't forget again. Now they teach the memory. Children grow up learning the architecture of resilience. They walk through ancient ruins knowing the walls once saved them, not just with shelter, but with meaning. They speak names of the fallen like sacred hymns, not just generals and soldiers, the mothers, the cooks, the janitors who kept the generators running. Everyone mattered. That's the world we tried to make in the ashes. Not perfect, just true. Dr. Hannah El Razi's last words are carved into the rebuilt on square in what used to be Nairobi. No flags, no borders, just a ring of stone and silence. The words? Let them choke on our noise. She never saw the new world, but maybe that was the point. Her story wasn't about seeing peace. It was about planting it. There's still debate, of course, about how much we should rebuild, how much of the past is worth bringing back, whether peace is just the next stage of war with better PR. But every time those questions get too loud, someone lights a candle in the center of an old battlefield. Not for the dead, for the future. And somehow the noise settles. Sometimes you'll find kids climbing on fallen seraphim, painting them, turning them into playgrounds. They don't flinch, don't fear, because to them, the machines aren't monsters anymore. They're just reminders that even the coldest things in the universe couldn't kill what makes us us. So no, this story doesn't end with a bang. It ends with breathing, with hands rebuilding what fire tried to take, with hearts still cracked, but beating, with people who carry the memory of war not as a burden, but as a guidepost. Because the world we leave behind won't be made of perfection. It'll be made of noise, of songs that don't rhyme, of laughter in the middle of broken places, of grief and love and the unfiltered, terrifying beauty of simply existing. That's the legacy. That's the human fire the seraphim couldn't erase. Not because it burned brightest, but because it refused to go out. And when the next stars come out, when something else from the void looks down and asks, "Who lived here?" we won't need to answer. The ruins will speak for us, and they'll say, "Humans lived here, and they were loud as hell."